This past Wednesday, Senate Democrats unanimously voted against a bill that would legally require that doctors provide life-saving care to infants born after a failed abortion. What the heck? Now, the media has been in an outrage after this happened, and pro-lifers are rightly criticizing Democrats for their refusal to acknowledge the personhood of infants who are born after an abortion, while Democrats are trying to save face and explain exactly why they didn't vote for such common sense legislation. Now, as a result, a ton of claims are circulating all over the internet, claims that contradict each other, and I wanted to dedicate an episode specifically just to analyzing what this bill is, how it's different from laws that already exist on the books, and talk about why Democrats don't agree with legislation of this nature. So what even is this bill in the first place? The Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act of 2025, that is a mouthful, was introduced in the US Senate on January 16th, 2025 by Senator James Lankford with co-sponsorship from Senator John Thune, I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly, and 43 other Republican senators. Now, this proposed legislation aims to amend Title 18 of the United States Code to mandate, and that word will become exceedingly important in the following minutes, that healthcare practitioners present during an abortion or attempted abortion that results in a live birth must provide the same degree of medical care to preserve the life of an infant as would be offered to any other child born at the same gestational age, and also ensure hospital admission of these infants. Now, as a result of Democrats voting against this bill, many pro-lifers have expressed their moral outrage. For example, Kristen Hawkins maintained that this was basically a vote for infanticide, and quote, "There is truly no level of evil greater than this." Matt Walsh, in always very concise fashion, maintained that this was an endorsement of infanticide. "I don't want to hear about moderate Dems, no such thing. They're all a bunch of satanic goblins." Wow. After explaining what the bill is, it seems as though it's pretty common sense. It seems like something people on both sides of the political aisle ought to be in agreement with. Not so. As was stated earlier, every Senate Democrat voted against this bill, and the liberal Democrat media maintains that actually this was justified because this was actually a very calculated move by Republicans to again enact quote-unquote anti-choice legislation. For example, U.S. Senator John Fetterman maintained, "I've always stood on the side of Roe and a woman's right to make her own healthcare choices. It's absurd to mandate criminalization because of those choices. Any bill that does so, including the Born Alive Survivors Protection Act, is a no from me." What the heck is going on here? Well, Democrats and the liberal media maintain that this bill actually, as I stated earlier, is a calculated move by Republicans to enact anti-choice legislation. And in reality, they maintain it's totally redundant. They maintain that there are already laws on the books that recognize that infants born during any gestational age, and yes, after a failed abortion, are indeed full US persons and equal in dignity and value to other infants. Now, is it actually true that this bill is totally redundant? In short, no, it's not true at all. There is legislation that recognizes the humanity and the personhood of infants born even after an abortion. The Born Alive Protection Act of 2002, for example, recognizes that all babies born after an abortion are persons under the law. Okay, so it does recognize this. But the crucial difference between that bill and the bill that was introduced recently is that the former bill did not introduce any criminal penalties for healthcare providers who fail to provide life-saving care. So the bill that was introduced actually isn't redundant. It's not redundant if there is other laws in the books, if this new law expands the scope of laws that are already there. Do we understand that? Redundancy means that it will have no impact whatsoever, that it's totally useless, that we already have laws in the books that cover this exactly. That is false. The laws that exist are merely a recognition of the personhood of the infant. But this bill goes further in requiring, mandating, legally enforcing the implications of recognizing the personhood of these infants. It requires that physicians who are responsible for an abortion, for example, take an infant to a hospital. It requires, legally mandates, that these infants are given life-saving care. In summation, this bill is different in the sense that it mandates medical care. It requires that any infant born alive during an abortion attempt must be immediately transported to the hospital for further care. And furthermore, this bill also includes criminal penalties such as fines or up to 5 years in prison. So in summation, in short, in brief, the 2002 law defines and acknowledges the personhood of the born alive infant. But the 2025 law introduces explicit obligations and penalties for healthcare providers, which essentially seeks to ensure that these infants do receive the immediate and appropriate medical care they are obligated to get if they are indeed persons. So To put this in other words, if you accept that fetuses who are born alive after a failed abortion are indeed persons under US law, then why would you object to a law that seeks to legally enforce that they are receiving life-saving care? That's what doesn't make sense to me, and this to me highlights what I think is honestly doublethink on behalf of Democrats who are pro-abortion. Doublethink refers to an Orwellian concept whereby somebody holds two contradictory positions at once, and I think this is exactly what's going on in this case. On the one hand, Senate Democrats maintain that they affirm the dignity and the humanity and the personhood of infants, but on the other hand, they're shooting down legislation that would enforce what we would regard as the logical legal implications of such a view. If somebody is a person endowed with dignity, and we have a moral and indeed legal obligation to respect that, then why would we not introduce legislation requiring that physicians honor the personhood of these infants by requiring that they actually give them the life-saving care? Now, this is one of the aspects of the legislation that Democrats are critical of. They're critical of introducing any criminal penalties whatsoever. They're critical of criminalizing abortionists to any degree. And this is what I find completely and totally absurd. If you accept the personhood of somebody, it makes sense to recognize legal duties that correspond to that. So not only does this expose, in my view, that Democrats and people who are pro-abortion do not genuinely believe that infants are full-fledged persons, because if they did, I would argue that they ought to recognize these legal responsibilities that are owed to infants who are born alive after an abortion attempt. But more than that, it exposes one of the most egregious flaws in their position, which is something that pro-lifers have shed light on for some time. You might have heard the argument that is often put in, comical terms of what is so magical about the birth canal that it transforms a non-person with no rights to a person with full-fledged rights. In essence, the view that fetuses prior to birth are not persons, but post-birth are persons, seems to imply that personhood, right? The idea that somebody is morally and legally valuable and ought to be protected by law is contingent upon one's geographical position. It's contingent upon literally where you are located. And when you think about that, when you chew on it for long enough, it seems to be patently and self-evidently absurd. It seems intuitive that personhood is not contingent upon one's location, but rather who they are. Many philosophers recognize that the differences between fetuses post-birth and fetuses after birth are so minuscule that if you want to be logically consistent in saying that a fetus prior to birth can be killed, then you should also accept that fetuses after birth can also be morally killed. In fact, one of the most famous papers in bioethics, written by two Italian philosophers, called Afterbirth Abortion, Why Should the Baby Live?, argues for this precise point. And many philosophers in the bioethics community who identify as pro-choice also accept the morality of infanticide. So while Democrats choose not to publicly state it, for one, I would say that in order to be logically consistent with their position, in practice, they're okay with it. They don't say it because obviously it's not politically savvy to maintain publicly that you are pro-abortion and pro-infanticide. But I will also note this, that the philosophers and the academics, the intellectuals, the bioethicists who spend time researching this and writing academic and philosophical papers arguing in support of their position, a lot of those people accept the morality, or at the very least the moral neutrality, the moral permissibility of infanticide. That is something that I believe a lot of pro-choicers have to contend with. And I truly believe that at the end of the day, there's no getting around that that is a position that, if one wants to be logically consistent, one ought to accept. Thanks for watching this episode. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, comment if you have any questions, or if there are any other things you'd like me to react to. Until then, stay blessed.